Hello, everybody, and welcome to Textile Talks. I am Maren Hanson, Curator of International Collections at the International Quilt Museum. We are located at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and we are the International Quilt Museum. We proudly steward and exhibit the world's largest collection of quilts and related textiles, which span 5 centuries and over 65 countries. Our mission is to build a global collection and audience that celebrates the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. If this is your passion too, and you aren't already a member, we'd love to have you join us. Visit our website at internationalquiltmuseum.org. The starting video highlighted our sponsors, but before we begin, I would like to recognize and thank the organizations that partner with the International Quilt Museum to bring you textile talks each week. And that would be the Quilt Alliance, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. We are honored to bring you free and inspiring programming each week with the help of our sponsors. We couldn't do it without their generosity and the generosity of viewers like you. So we have just a couple of housekeeping reminders before we get started. There is a box, of course, for Q&A, so please use that if you have any questions. And then there is the chat box. And I know many of you have already used it to say hello. And that's where you can leave commentary or you can make suggestions how we can improve Textile Talks. If you prefer not to see notifications from the chat, you can click on the chat button to toggle them on or off. The live captions make Textile Talks accessible to a wider audience. If you prefer not to view the captions, you should be able to turn them off. So thank you for joining us. And as always, Textile Talks is made possible by the support of our generous sponsors and donors like you. Next week's talk, I just want to bring up to make sure you come back in a week from now. It will be Phyllis Michael Wong talking about the Gossard girls and their quilts, artifacts of history. And that's presented by the Quilt Alliance. So now I am going to go ahead and share my screen because I am joined by my colleague, now Nomura of Saitama University in suburban Tokyo. And she and I are your presenters today. We will be talking about the Japanese Quiltmaker Oral History Project that we have spearheaded. So hello now.
Hi, Maren.
Very happy to have you here with me today.
Thank you. And hi, everyone. I'm happy to join this talk. Thank you.
So to begin with, I just want to give you an outline of what we're going to be covering today, just to give you sort of a roadmap for our talk. First, we'll just give you an overview of our Japanese Quiltmaker Oral History Project. We'll talk a little bit about what our next steps will be. And then we will introduce you to each of the 10 Quiltmaker participants or informants. And then we will talk a little bit about some of the major themes that have been identified so far. And I underline so far because now and I are still in the midst of analyzing all of this data that we have accumulated.
Yeah, we have a lot of work ahead, but we are happy that what we've done so far, right?
That's right. A lot of work ahead, but it's a lot of fun and we enjoy working together. So to give you an overview of our project, the Japanese Quiltmaker Oral History Project, what we did so far is we have interviewed 10 artists, all of whom were invited to participate in an exhibition that the International Quilt Museum produced in 2021 called Abstract Design in American Quilts at 50, Journey to Japan. And we interviewed these artists and makers on a range of topics. We performed these oral history interviews over a 2-month period last spring, sort of between mid-April and mid-June of 2023. Mainly these were performed at each informant's studio or home. And the metropolitan areas that we visited were Tokyo, Sendai, Kyoto, and Nara. So after we perform those interviews, there have been, of course, many other processes that have to happen. Transcription of these usually roughly hour-long videos, translation, and then now we are in the stage of analysis. So now and I are going through all of these translated scripts, and obviously now speaks Japanese. So she has also been verifying that the translations were done properly. And so it's a very complex process, and it has more steps, I think, than I really had thought about prior to embarking on the project. So I mentioned on the previous slide that the 10 people we interviewed were all participants in this exhibition. It was held in 2021 here at the International Quilt Museum. And the original intention had been to interview each of these participants in 2020. But we all know what happened in 2020. So this project got delayed by several years. But if you would like to know more, oh, excuse me, my lights have gone off. If you'll just hold on one moment. Thank you. It's good for energy savings, but not for when you're presenting. If you would like to learn more about abstract design in American Quilts at 50, we did do a textile talk on the quilts that were created for that exhibition. So you can go to our website, internationalquiltmuseum.org, to find that, or you can just go to YouTube to our channel and you can learn more about that specific exhibition.
And there's also a beautiful catalog that went along with the
Right.
exhibition, I believe.
Thank you. Now that's
Which,
right.
Yeah, I
So-
didn't get to see the exhibition, so.
Right, that was a
Because
bad time.
I wasn't, bad timing, but I enjoy the catalog.
So as I mentioned, we interviewed in 4 metropolitan areas, although you can off in the west there, Kyoto and Nara are pretty much right next to each other. So we were able to do those in the same time period. The majority of interviewees were in Tokyo, and one person was in the north, in Sendai. And for those of you, I love maps. I'm a kind of a map nut. So for those of you who want to know the parts of Tokyo we were in, each of those hearts represents either the home or studio of someone we interviewed in Tokyo. So you can see there were a couple people right in the heart of Tokyo and then sort of spreading out into more suburban areas. And of course, in order to perform these interviews, we needed to have sort of an interview guide. So the guide that Now and I put together, we wanted it to, you can see here that it's in quadrants because we wanted to focus on several different areas. So we wanted to just talk to them about their history as quilt makers and sort of what influenced them on their path as quilt makers and quilt teachers. Then below that artistic approach, we wanted to really sort of mine them for what their specific approach to quilt making is, how they see themselves as artists, those kinds of things. And then, so the upper right quadrant addresses specifically the Holstein Vanderhoof collection, which is here at the International Quilt Museum. And those are a group of quilts. It's a large collection, a portion of which were included in a really influential exhibition in 1971, Abstract Design in American Quilts, which was held at the Whitney Museum in New York, but it also, a few years later, traveled to Japan. It went to both Kyoto and Tokyo and several other cities as well. So we did want to ask the makers if they were aware of that exhibition. Additionally, if you go watch our textile talk about that Journey to Japan exhibition, you'll find out that each of those artists had actually responded to, we commissioned them essentially to make a quilt, but what we asked them to do was to respond to one of the antique quilts in that Holstein Vanderhoof collection. And we'll be showing you all of those in just a moment. So we wanted to talk to them a little bit about that. And then we also wanted to ask them about the quilt they made, what their thought process was while they were making it. How they chose to interpret the original antique quilt. So in order to have a consistent approach to these interviews, this was the guide that we used. In terms of next steps, as I said, we're not done with our analysis. We will keep going. And what we're going to be sharing with you today is just sort of what we have mined so far, what we have gleaned from all of these interviews. And eventually, now we'll be using some of this content in the classes she teaches at Saitama University, specifically the material culture classes, right now?
Right. And also last year when Marin was in Japan to conduct these interviews, we taught a class together and we used some of the materials that we had collected at that time. And I think it was very successful using sort of actual oral history content into a classroom. And I don't think a lot of my students had never worked on oral history project or participated in analysis part of it. And I think it was an interesting sort of tryout. And I'm looking forward to incorporating more of this project into my classes next year.
Yeah, and I think we here at the University of Nebraska, there's a great opportunity for us to work with professors here as well to incorporate some of this data. The main project that we here at the International Quilt Museum will be using the interviews and the interview data for is a World Quilts module. And if you have never been to our World Quilts site, I would encourage you to go. It's worldquilts.quiltstudy.org, and we have many different modules on different topics, and each module takes a deep dive into a certain topic, whether it's a geographical location or a time period, or our main module or our original module looks at American quilts sort of in a holistic way. So we want to add one called the Japanese story, and this content from the oral histories will help inform our creation of that. And we had so much fun doing these interviews that we are looking to apply for more funding so that we can do more interviews.
More
because
interviews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was
More
very
interviews
enlightening.
and more analysis, right?
That's right. More interviews leads to more analysis. And then we would also love to work with other partners. And we know that Naomi Ichikawa, Teresa Duryea Wong, and many other people have done interviews of quilt makers in Japan. And so it would be great, to find ways for us to come together. So those are all steps that we are going to be proceeding with as time goes on. So we'll just take a little time here now to introduce you to each of the informants. And I'm presenting them here in alphabetical order. And their name is there in Japanese style with their family name first and given name second. So this is Fujita Kumiko, and she lives in Tokyo. And she trained professionally as a graphic designer. And when we get started looking at some of our quilts here in a minute, you'll really be able to tell where that training has been put to use. And this was interesting now that she self-identifies as a quilt designer, correct? Oh, I think I may have lost it now. She seems frozen. Okay, well, in any case, a lot of the makers that we talked to identified as quilt makers and as quilt artists and as quilt teachers. But Fujita-san, she really emphasized the fact that quilt design was her main area. Isn't that right now?
Right, and she, when we began the interview, when she introduced herself, she specifically identified herself as quilt designer, not quilt maker or quilt artist. And we thought that was very interesting that she was, as far as I know, she was the only one that I've met so far who identified her professional career as a designer rather than a maker or artist. And that relates to her background that we will be introducing, sharing shortly.
Yeah, and so here you can, as I said, as soon as you see one of her quilts, you can really tell that she has a graphic design background. This was the actual Journey to Japan exhibition, and her interpretation is the red, black, and white quilt on the wall there. And then off to the right, you can see we included a reproduction of the original Holstein Vanderhoof quilt that she responded to. I think this is a really interesting response for sure.
Right.
And you can tell, again, her background shines through here. She, as we were saying, she self-identifies as a designer, and she has published several books with patchwork patterns, all of which have that really great sort of sophisticated graphic design quality to them. And she's known for her alphabet quilts. She's really worked with sort of almost like a font, different font styles of creating blocks with the alphabet. So you see that on the right. Next is Goke Keiko. So Goke-san, she is the person who lives way up north in Sendai. She's a fabric designer. You can see there, we were at her home / studio, and we were able to see bolts and bolts and bolts of her amazing fabric. So I think she's very well known as a fabric designer. She is self-taught in terms of quilt making, and she did help, and we'll hear her very briefly talk about this in a few minutes. She helped organize with Ichikawa-san a charity quilt program during the great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami of 2011. And this was the quilt she made in response to a Holstein Vanderhoof quilt. Really bright, bold, and beautiful, and it was actually on the cover of our book. And she has also a very distinct aesthetic, bright colors, sort of quirky piecing. Yeah, you can really
and
tell.
some people call her colors Goke colors, I think, that
Goke
bright
colors, I like that.
Goke colors.
She's got to trademark that maybe. And we were able to see sort of some works in progress while we were there. Her sketchbooks are always fascinating to me, to see how a maker or artist thinks through the process of making a quilt. So that was really fun to be able to see sort of those works in progress. Next is Hatano Shoko. She's in Tokyo, and she is she makes frequent appearances at Quilt National. And in 2011, she won the Hilary M. Fletcher Persistence Pays Award. And she really self-identifies as an artist in the larger sense. And she's part of a multimedia art group. And I think she feels like that's a big part of her identity, is working with artists in other media. And I really like her work, along with another artist we'll see in a minute. Because of the gestural quality of her work, it really has sort of it almost has a written or calligraphic quality to it. And she also uses bright, shiny colors as well. And so it really stands out. So this was the piece she made for Journey to Japan, responding to the crazy quilt you can see sort of off on the left there. And more of her sort of, very gestural.
And very like brush painting sort of stroke appearance done in fabric.
Yep. Next is Katagiri Yoshiko. She lives in Nara, which is an ancient capital of Japan. And she only works by hand. I'm pretty sure, like I'm pretty confident that that's the only way she works, is by hand. And she was the winner of the top prize at the very first Quilt Nihon competition in 1989. So that's one of her many claims to fame. This is the piece she made for the Journey to Japan exhibition. Fantastic interpretation of the log cabin quilt, the original antique log cabin quilt. I love this jellyfish. And again, this is done all by hand. And even all of those black background blocks, they're all log cabins, even though it was just sort of forming the background. She stuck with the log cabin all the way through. One of my favorite pieces. They're all wonderful, but I really like the jellyfish. So on the left, that was the piece that won the top prize at the Quilt Nihon competition, which is the competition sponsored by the Japan Handicraft Instructors Association. And then the piece on the right, I love as well. She's so accomplished with applique, and that flower I think really highlights her ability there. And again, a huge enjoyable part of this interview process was being able to be in the homes and studios of the artists. And Katagiri-san, she's so warm and welcoming. She has the cutest dog ever, who was also warm and welcoming. And she works often with her daughter, who wrote her doctoral dissertation on Japanese quilt history, quilt makers and quilt history. So they work very closely together, and it's always just a joy to go to her studio. They pull out quilt after quilt after quilt, and it's just really, really fun.
We don't know when to stop. Right?
That's right. That's right. This is Konishi Harue, and she is in Tokyo. She trained as an oil painter, so she went to art school and really loved painting, but discovered that painting was not very practical, especially when she was raising her kids. And she started quilt making. And she often works with antique silk kimono fabrics, many of which were sort of passed down within her own family or her husband's family. And I just love the fact that they live in her husband's family, the Meiji era house. So probably late 19th or early 20th century, something like that now.
Right. Yep. And it's very old.
Yes, very, very
traditional house with a traditional storage attached to the house where she keeps her, I think, textile collections.
And she changes her hair color frequently.
Right.
Something else I like.
This time it was green.
Yep, this time it was green, but I know she's done hot pink several times.
Blues and
Yep. So this quilt is the one she made for Journey to Japan, made out of silk, kimono silks, I believe from her mother's or her mother-in-law's kimono. And so here again, seeing people's studios is always so much fun. She had lots of sort of scrapbooks, sort of sketchbooks around, but then also within this atmosphere of a very traditional Japanese home with shoji screens and a beautiful garden out. You can just sort of start to glimpse it there. So again, part of this whole process, it felt immersive to me because we were able to go and spend time in their sort of native environment. Koseki Suzuko is also in Tokyo. She too is a fabric designer, very successful fabric designer. And she is also very, very active as a teacher and judge, and works often with the Japan Handicraft Instructors Association. So they're the organizers of the Quilt Nihon competition. But they also have, quilt classes, quilt making school. And she really loves to use fabrics with words in them. You can start to see some of those words in English pop out on these quilts, sort of either feed sacks or reproductions of feed sacks, or just words. Fabrics with words is one of her favorite materials to use. And she loves doing sort of strip piecing and log cabin style quilts. Again, lots of, there's my light going off. Excuse me. I guess I need to be gesticulating a little bit more. But as a, as a fabric designer and as a maker and a teacher, she obviously also then publishes books of her patterns, successful in there. And again, it was really fun to just see all of the bolts and bolts and bolts of fabrics that she has designed in her studio. Kuroha Shizuko, Kuroha-san, she's an elder stateswoman of Japanese quilt making. She's in Tokyo as well. She learned quilt making in the US in the mid-70s when her husband was stationed in the US. His company sent him to the US.
Right.
And she was one of the first quilt teachers in Japan, and also one of the first to start using antique Japanese fabrics in her quilts. And something that I think is interesting, just primarily because I work for the International Quilt Museum, is that she actually met Robert and Artist James, who are the International Quilt Museum's sort of original benefactors. And they went and visited her in her studio. They had learned of her work, liked it, and so they went to her studio when they were their quilts had come over here, gone over to Tokyo, excuse me, in 1990. And again, she's known for using antique indigo fabrics. You can see a lot of them here. And she has a very recognizable style, I would say, very complex. And we had an exhibition of her work at our museum several years ago. That's what this is. And again, it was just so much fun to be in her home, in her tatami room, talking with her. She pulled out samples of things that she's working on. Next is Okano Eiko. She's in Tokyo, and she actually saw the abstract design in American Quilts exhibition, the Holstein Vanderhoof quilts that traveled to the Shiseido Gallery in Tokyo in 1975. She loves creating design notebooks. She loves food more than almost anything else. And she too loves to use words on her quilts. So we'll see a little bit more about that in a minute. This is the piece she made for our exhibition. And there's a food quilt with words. So nice to see both of those coming together. And when we exhibited her quilts in our museum, we actually had a display of tables because each of those mini quilts was a different dish. So it was fun to have them out on tables as if you could sit down and consume some of her quilts. Here are some of her notebooks. And here's Saito Yasuko. She's the other artist who I think has a really gestural quality to her work. I went too fast there. She works with washi paper and ink. She used to sell kimono, so she knows fabrics really, really well. And just something super interesting to me is that she's a longtime volleyball player. I love it. She's a very active woman, and she's played around the world in club volleyball. So you can see that, again, that gestural quality, sweeping, arcing movement in her quilts. And her quilt was actually on the cover of the Quilt National Catalog in 2021. A studio shot, and then some of the washi paper she works with. And our final quilt maker / artist is Emiko Todalobe, and she works in both Kyoto and New York City. She founded the New Zephyrs Quilt Group in 2001, and that group exhibits annually in Tokyo and Kyoto. She trained as a musician, and she too was the other person we interviewed who saw the Holstein and Vanderhoof quilts, but she saw them in Kyoto, not Tokyo, in 1976. Here's her piece for our exhibition Journey to Japan in 2021, and these are some pieces that were on view during one of the New Zephyrs exhibitions. And we also displayed her quilts at the International Quilt Museum several years ago. And she is very well known for making double-sided quilts. That's sort of her trademark. And so we were able to build these frames so that you could see both sides of the quilts. And they are not the same image on the two sides. They're often completely different images, double-sided. it would take too long for me to try to explain the technique, but it's yeah, quite fascinating that she is able to do that. So to get into talking a little bit about what we have discovered so far in analyzing these interview translations, transcriptions and translations, is that the categories of things they talked about or information they shared fell into two major categories, sort of a practical or artistic approach, sort of more, yeah, just how to, like how they pursue their craft or their art. And then there were lots of comments that were more sort of abstract and conceptual, just about being an artist. So some of the areas that fall into the practical or artistic approach, in other words, sort of the act of making, they emphasized a lot of them, most of them emphasized the importance of just having basic sewing skills and using traditional patterns. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that they're teachers. Most of them are teachers. And so they feel they need to really pass those basic skills along to their students. Every one of them really emphasized wanting to be different and have their own voice, which I think is great. So that's the two sides. You know, as a teacher, you teach the traditional patterns, but as an artist, you really want to have your own approach and your own voice. And color was a huge thing. Every single one of them talked about the importance of learning how to work with color. And then some of them talked a bit about, again, the teacher-student relationship. So we have several video clips to share with you, and I'm hoping that all the technology is going to work. So here is Shizuko
黒羽さんの作品って藍染めっていうイメージ、藍とサラサっていうイメージ、まあね、最初の方の本もそうだったし、っていうイメージがあるんだけど、特に藍とかサラサっていう布自体に自分らしさがあるっていうふうには考えては
特には考えてない。で、もう、藍染めっていうのは、どういうふうに私が決めてるかっていうと、空気感こう、手ですくい取れない色だと思う。
藍が。
空の色も青だし、海の水も青い。でも、海の水も空の、青空も、こう、すごく山の頂に行けば、青に届くかもしれないって思うけども、稜線がくっきり円形って見えるじゃない。ここの森があって、その上に青い空があってっていうね、本当に絵に描いたように写真に写ってくれる。でも、山の頂に、萩山の頂に立ったからって言って、自分が青の空にの中で佇んでるわけじゃないね。そこの周りは無色透明だし、青はどんどん遠くにしかないって。谷川俊太郎がそういう詩を書いた。だから、その青っていうのは、青を使えば一番、こう、抵抗がなく、ベースを青にしたら、スッとこう空気感があって、円形にもなれるっていう。
So in that clip, Kuroha-san is talking about blue, indigo dye, and I love her sort of sophisticated understanding and presentation of what blue can do in her artwork. It's not one-dimensional by any means. It can create so many different planes. And now, were you going to say something?
Yeah. No, you can go ahead. I'll
okay.
Add after.
So, I mean, since she's known for blue, I think it was really interesting to hear her talk specifically about how she uses that color sort of. But then she also said she doesn't now asked her if it's her trademark, and she wanted, she doesn't want to be pinned down just to blue. So I thought that was very interesting. We have another clip here, her talking about blue a little bit more.
まあここにいっぱい藍染めの布あるけれども、これは全部こうどういう この空気感を表すっていうと、
茶色、
悪いです
いや、茶色の色は壁になっちゃうじゃん。
はい。
でも、青っていうのはね、夜空の満天の星のベースも青でいいんじゃない？黒に近い青。遠くはね。でも、無色透明の水しかないのに、手ですくっても絶対青はないのに、この海の続きの円形は青い水。
じゃあこれって透明でもありる？
透明感に見える色なの。だから、こういう近くで見ると、四角なんですよね、かすりっていうのは。粒だから。だから四角で、絵師がいるじゃない。若冲の30人以上もいる職人が点で描いた絵じゃない、あれ。
若冲って職人あれ描いてるんですか？
そうです。
So here, this is the first time, and we will hear another time when one of the artists talks about Jakuchu, and he was a Japanese artist in the 18th century, and several people cite him as an influence. And so you can see here, she was talking about stippling and dots. And so he actually had apprentices, as she said, who worked in this grid system that apparently it makes sense that a quilt maker would respond to this sort of this grid format, especially Kuroha-san, because she does work in a very precise mathematical way. So it was interesting to know that several people mentioned this 18th century artist.
And also Kuroha-san's work, some of her work has very curved pattern, or what seems like curved patterns, but when you look at when you get closer, it's actually a graded lines like Jakchu's grid painting, and I thought that was really fascinating reference to his work, and also about her blues. What was striking to me when I was interviewing her was that her work is known for deep indigo. Again, like Marin said, she doesn't want to be pinned down to that, but she uses rich palettes of blues, but she explains that as transparent, and it has depth, and that was very striking to me about her understanding of indigo blues.
Yeah, a very subtle and nuanced approach.
Very much so.
To blue.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and in this clip,
一人で描いてないです。
she
もの
continues
すごい
talking about
彼は
Jakchu.
人気者だったから、弟子がいっぱいいて、その弟子がワクワクしながら点を打っていく。で、だから言ってみればカメラと一緒なんだって聞いたことあるけども、で、そういう集団で描いても、一人の人の絵としての若冲のデッサン力で成立してる。で、そういうものがかすりにも言えると思うんですよね。だから最初にこの絵の元絵を描いた絵師が優れてたんだと思う。絵がすりっていうのもあるけども。でそれだってこう糸の線での点での集合体でできてるんだけど、これが遠くにあったらもう点に見えちゃうじゃない。この細かいこの粒をパッチワークで縫い代つけて縫うことはできないけども、これを利用したら私の世界は広がると。だからその世界をせっかくのその世界を台無しにしないでねっていうのを伝えておきたい。かすりを使ってたら誰でもその世界が手に入ると思ったら大間違いよね。
じゃあそのかすりの
計算づくでやってる私は。
じゃあ
And so I really, she has such a poetic approach, I think, to kasuri, the ikat fabrics, And I love, again, that she doesn't want to be pinned down to just being someone who uses kasuri, just to use kasuri. It's one tool in her toolbox, in her artist's toolbox. And I just love that, that she says, I construct my world sort of with intentionality. I'm not just using kasuri randomly. I'm using each piece in a very specific way. So again, here's to show that grid, the Jakuchu artwork, Masumegaki grid painting, and you can see the relationship between it and the figurative ikat, the egasuri, excuse me. Thank you. And again, it requires a grid. It requires mathematical precision that you get everything lined up when you're making those ikat fabrics. Next, we have Fujita-san, and she is talking about Jakuchu as well. So this was another artist who talks about his influence on her work.
じゃあ、新しいキルトを作ろうって思うような、なんかこう、
きっかけがな
イン
いと作んな
スピレーションってどういうところから？
インスピレーション、本当にここに来る、これがスタートの時のインスピレーションが、まずこの若冲の、これですね。ここあまり、あれか、はい。このグリッド。伊藤若冲のグリッド。これを2003年の、森美術館六本木にありますよね。第1回目のこけら落としがハピネスっていう展示会だったんです。その時に初めて伊藤若冲を肉眼で見た時に、あ、なんか心にビビあれどっかで聞いたね、ビビってね。聖子ちゃんビビってきまして、もちろんこれ1センチ弱かな。なんですけど、私は今2センチのグリッドにもう自分のスタイルを決めてるんですけど、この若冲のグリッドっていう、そのフリーの絵なんだけど、そのグリッドになってるっていうののすごく面白いなと思ったのと、グラフィックデザインのこのグリッドシステム。これもちろんグラフィックデザインにおける編集、そういう時の、1960年代、70年代までのグリッドシステム、きちんと方眼になっている部分にレイアウトをしていく。それに対して今はブロークングリッドっていうので、自由に楽しんでレイアウト、もちろんミックスもありますけど、そういうようなものがこの2つが底辺になって、こちらがドームの皮切りになるかな、これが。で、そしたら、ペーパーピーシングでしました。何が早くできる。一番初め、ウールって言いました。
これペーパーピーシング。
ペーパーピーシング。
So again, she's talking about Jakuchu and his grid system, but also then talking about mid-century design. So again, that brings in her graphic design background really well, I think. I'm going to keep going here because I want us to be able to get as many of these clips shown for you as possible. Just another shot of Jakuchu and his grid painting, a detail. So again, I'm super interesting that these artists are bringing him up both. I'll skip this clip because mainly what she's talking about is the influence of Bauhaus, de Stijl, Russian constructivism, or constructivist approaches. And you can really see, so we have on the left some examples of that, and you can see really how influenced she clearly is by those 20th century art movements, with the very bold colors and sharp graphic qualities and shapes. In this clip, she talks about her relationship with her students, which I think is really interesting.
で身になってきてくれるかなとは思ってますけど。
ご自身そのデザイナーとしての、立場と、でも生徒さんにはもっと自分が作る作品とは違った表現方法なんかも教えられるっていう、 デザイナーとしてのご自分と先生としてのご自分とこうバランスって何かありますか？
バランス
境界とかバランスとか。
それは多分、自分は自分、人は人。生徒さんの持ってる個性を伸ばしたい。それが私の仕事、私のお教室でやるべきことって分けてますので、それはないですね。今言ったような、ただ、自分と方向性が好きだなと思う人には、自分の持ってるものの、こうやるといいよとか、この辺の資料を、掘り下げてみってどこの国の言葉掘り下げてごらんって言うと、本当ただバウハウスよりか、バウハウスの中のこの教授陣の、だから誰がいいとかっていうようなところをもっと掘り下げてみるといいよとかっていうのは、その人の興味を持っているところに対して、例えば森凪とか、もう全然マニアックな人ですけど、あの人の考えている幅の広さは面白いよとかって言って、いうふうに、そうすると面白いもので、勉強って一つのことを掘り下げると、そこに私は芋掘りだって言うんですけど、一つやるともうそこに本当にね、勉強って楽しいよっていうことをそれだけは伝えたいですね。だから自分の調べたい方向に対して私はサポートをするっていう形が自分の役目かな。だからすごい自慢じゃないけど、個性を引き出すのは上手かな。意地悪だけどね。怖いけどね。怖いけどいいところもあるよね。っていう感じかな。
And at the end there, she's sort of lightly joking about herself. Sometimes I am strict, I am scary, but good. And I can't imagine her being scary. She was so lovely. But I love that idea that she's sharing her love of things like Bauhaus with her students and recommending specific artists to look at and responding to their needs and using her own knowledge to help them. So our last category, or our second category, had to do with sort of more abstract ideas, conceptual, and about just being a maker. So a lot of people talked about sort of their personal stories, their backgrounds, how they came to quilt making. They talked about the influence of American culture on their quilt making, and then telling stories or making stories in their quilts. And then sources of inspiration, of course, came into play. And quilts as therapy also came up fairly often, both in terms of therapy, like helping other people, but also quilt making as therapy for yourself. For instance, a lot of the makers started quilt making when they were raising their children, and life was kind of hectic, and quilt making provided them with sort of an outlet. And then they just sort of kept doing it and ran with it. So we have a few clips to share there. I'm going to skip the video clip here and just explain what Kuroha-san was talking about. This is the quilt on the right that she made, responding to the one on the left, which is a Holstein Vanderhoof quilt. And what she talks about is the fact that she was really influenced, what she was thinking of when she made that was like sort of going out in the evening in ancient Edo. So Edo being modern day Tokyo, the Edo period being 1603 to 1868. And so I wanted to share just, she talks about the Kawara style roof in her being an inspiration. And you can tell it has that sort of repeating grid that was in her quilt. And then I loved the idea of Edo, an evening out in Edo being an inspiration for her quilt. I'm moving right along because I want to leave time for some questions at the end. This is a clip of Okano Eiko. So Eiko-san, or excuse me, Okano-san talking about her love of words. And she's the artist who earlier we showed her quilts with lots of food on them, but also with lots of words. So here she's talking about when she was in college and writing a book of poetry.
そう印刷してもらってここでホッチキスで留めて まずこういうものを作った、
はい
お友達と2人で、
うん
だからこれは私の詩ね、ポエム。そんなことしてたのよ。だから文章を書くのがすごく好きで、
じゃあその詩を文章を書くのが好きっていうことってキルトにも大きい
そうなの。
影響を与えていて、だから
そうなの
先生のキルトって
文がついてるでしょ、
うん
そうなの。それで今考えるとね、言葉をつないでいくっていうことと切れをつなぐっていうことは全く同じなのよ。
うんうん
だと思うの。
うんうん
だから私は今言葉をつないでいるんじゃなくて切れをつないでいるんだけど、なんかやっぱり詩を書いてるのと一緒ね。
キルトを作られる時って
うん
こう詩を書いてるような、
詩を書くっていうか言葉をつなぐ、思いをつなぐってことか、じゃないかなと思うの。
So yeah, I love that she's comparing patchwork and poetry. And what was the sense you got there now?
Yeah, it was interesting that she, as a young woman, she did some sewing, I think, but she also was into writing poems and writing. Yeah, like she said, she enjoyed putting words together, and that resonates with her current quilt making. That she's not really just she may not be writing. I mean, she writes a lot as well. I mean, she writes beautiful letters with drawing that she does, watercolor drawing, but patching, putting fabrics together and putting words together, for her it's sort of a similar practice that she's done for a long time since she was young. And I thought that was a very interesting process and progress in her artistic expression, that it may have shifted more toward textiles, but again, it remains sort of the spirit is still there, that from her younger age.
Yeah, I love the idea that these two loves of hers are coming together so intimately in her work. This is our final clip. This is Goke-san talking about charity quilts that were made during the Tohoku, the earthquake in 2011.
その後に市川さん、ダイアリーの編集長、彼女がコンフォートキルトって、あちこちから集めてものすごい数来たけど、それの海外からもたくさん来たんだけど、それの被災した人たちのところに届ける手伝いとかはしてた。
でもそういう活動もありますよね。命は助けるのか。命っていうか生活の
何にもなくなったじゃん結局。だからキルト1枚でも毛布の代わりになったりとかした人もいたみたいです。
Yeah, I think you could tell that it was she could really still feel the warmth of all those people donating quilts for this dramatic moment, for this to help the survivors of the earthquake and tsunami.
Yeah, when I asked her that question, I first hesitated to ask because I'm from Tokyo and I wasn't actually living in Japan at that time, so I was sort of semi-outsider in terms of the earthquake and what a lot of people went through. But she was very I guess upfront about what she was experiencing, and she kindly generously shared what she experienced during the hard time and what she did with quilts, and how quilts were a sort of a form of comfort,
Right.
to a lot of people, including herself, I believe.
Right. So for others and for herself.
Mhm.
So we are very close to being out of time, and we have a few minutes left for questions, but I just wanted to emphasize that we really loved working with these 10 quilt makers. And now I think there was a point you wanted to make about that.
Yeah, and I think we or IQM International Quilt Museum and Marin and have established a really close relationship with these quilt makers that I think we had a trust between us. So we were able to hear, to me, it was a surprise that they oftentimes they started with their personal stories, very intimate stories when we asked them how they started making quilts. And I think that was, having a really good close relationship made these interviews more, I don't want to say successful, but very meaningful. And we were able to hear a lot of stories that because of that relationship that we had established in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And we always look forward to meeting them again. So hopefully we will get to see all these quilt makers again in the near future. So we just want to thank the project informants, our project sponsor, the Robert and Artist James Foundation. We received great help from Ryoko Kobayashi of Janus Gallery, and she's also on the IQM Advisory Board, Saitama University, which is Nao's institution, and the International Quilt Museum here at the University of Nebraska. You can reach us here, and we have about 2 minutes, and I'm going to try to quickly answer some of the questions we have here. Someone asked if the catalog from our IQM exhibition is still available. Yes, it is. You can find it on our website. An archivist asked if we were going to be archiving these videos. Eventually, yes, we will have the videos and the transcripts and translations available eventually. And certainly they would be archived here at the University of Nebraska archives, but perhaps elsewhere additionally. Let's see. Do the quilters ever get together for communal projects? I'm not so sure about that. What do you think now?
Some teachers, if they have classes, they might make sort of friendship type of quilt as for an exhibition. Not all teachers do that, but I know some quilt artists who have classes do.
Okay, and that sort of also answers someone's question about how do the quilt makers, designers, artists typically pass down their knowledge and skills? For example, are there apprentices who study with them? And yeah, I mean, each of these women has a group of students who have been with them sometimes for decades.
Yeah, 20, 30 years. And some students travel far, like 2-3 hour bullet train ride to take classes from their teachers.
So that's definitely one way in which their knowledge will sort of keep going down through the generations. And now, did you see one you wanted to answer? Because we're just about time's up, but if there's one more.
Sure. So someone asked if the teachers, quilt artists, design their own quilts, but have their students make as part of their training. Yes, some do. The quilt teacher may make a top and students may help with quilting, but others just work on their own entirely. So it depends on the individual.
Great. Well, I think we were able to get to at least most of the questions. Our email addresses are here on the screen if you have other questions. Stay tuned because, as we said, we're just sort of we're in the throes of our analysis. So hopefully more will be coming. And thank you so much for joining us at Textile Talks. Thank you now for being my co-presenter. And we'll see you at the next Textile Talk. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.